For 3,000 years, the Galactic Collective had told stories about them. Every species in the known galaxy had heard the tales passed down from generation to generation. The vanished ones, the ghost species, the creatures called humans. Elder Counselor Veteran of the Corvati species stood in the Grand Chamber of Nexus, Prime, and looked out at the assembled representatives of 12 civilizations. His scaled skin reflected the artificial starlight that filled the room. He was old and tired, and he had given this same report many times before. "We have discovered another dead world," he announced to the council. "Sector 7 Gamma. The atmosphere shows signs of carbon-based life. There is evidence of primitive settlements, but all traces of intelligent life have been gone for at least 2,000 years." Ambassador Salira of the Ethoni leaned forward in her seat. Her luminescent wings were folded behind her back, and her large eyes showed concern. "Another victim of the Great Silence?" "So it appears," Vethron replied. The Great Silence was the name they had given to the mysterious disappearance of humanity. According to ancient records recovered from ruins scattered across 100 different worlds, humans had once been a spacefaring civilization. They had reached out to the stars nearly 5,000 years ago. They had established colonies on distant planets. They had made contact with the ancestors of the species that now ruled the galaxy. And then they had vanished without a trace. Some believed they had destroyed themselves in a terrible war. Others thought a plague had spread through their worlds and wiped them out completely. A few scholars whispered that they had abandoned this dimension entirely and ascended to some higher plane of existence that lesser species could not understand. Over the centuries, humans had become nothing more than myth. They were characters in children's stories. They were a cautionary tale that parents told their young ones about the fragility of civilizations and the importance of unity. Commander Zethaner stood at the back of the council chamber and listened to the proceedings with growing frustration. He was the military advisor to the Corvati delegation, and he had spent decades studying the old records. He had examined the ruins on a dozen worlds. He had analyzed every scrap of evidence that remained from the human era. Humans had been described as adaptable creatures who could survive in almost any environment. They were persistent beings who never gave up, even when facing impossible odds. They were dangerously creative and could solve problems in ways that other species never imagined. Species like that did not simply disappear. But 3,000 years of silence was hard to argue against. Every search had found nothing. Every expedition had returned empty. The humans were gone, and they were never coming back. "The matter is closed," Vethran declared. "We shall catalog the ruins and move on to more pressing concerns." The Vorkash Dominion grows bolder along the Outer Rim territories. The council murmured in agreement. The Vorkash were a militaristic species that had been expanding aggressively for the past century. They absorbed smaller civilizations into their empire without mercy. They respected only strength, and the collective's defensive fleet was stretched thin trying to contain them. Far from the council chamber, in a remote monitoring station on the very edge of known space, a young Corvati technician named Peller was running routine scans of the void. His station was old and poorly maintained because it monitored the dead zone, a vast region of space where no ships ever traveled. Ancient navigational charts marked the dead zone as forbidden territory. The record said it was contaminated by radiation from a war fought before recorded history. No sane pilot would venture into that darkness. Peller was bored. He had been assigned to this station as punishment for a minor infraction, and he hated every moment of it. Nothing ever happened in the dead zone. He was considering taking an early rest cycle when his sensors detected something that should have been impossible. A fleet of ships was emerging from the dead zone. Peller stared at his display and felt his heart begin to race. Ships of a design he had never seen before were appearing on his sensors. They were massive vessels with dark angular hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved in perfect formation like predators hunting together. There were hundreds of them. Peller's hands trembled as he initiated a closer scan. The ships bore markings and symbols that matched nothing in the collective's database. Their power signatures were off the charts. Their weapon systems were unlike anything he had ever studied. Then the translation matrix caught a fragment of their communications. The computer worked for several seconds before producing a result that made Peller's blood run cold. English, an ancient human language that had not been spoken in 3,000 years. Peller reached for the emergency transmitter with shaking claws. He had to warn someone. He had to tell the council. The myths were real, and they were coming. On the bridge of the USS Resolute, Fleet Admiral Catherine Blake stood with her hands clasped behind her back and watched the stars through the main viewport. She was a woman in her 60s with gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen more than any human should have to see. Behind her, the bridge crew worked at their stations with quiet efficiency. After 3,000 years of preparation, humanity was finally returning to the galaxy. Admiral, her executive officer, spoke up. He was a tall man named Daniel Price, with broad shoulders and a calm demeanor. "We are being scanned by a monitoring station at the edge of their territory." Blake nodded slowly, but did not turn from the viewport. "Let them look. They have forgotten us. They think we are nothing but stories told to children. Should we attempt communication? Not yet." Blake watched the distant stars that her ancestors had once called home. "Let the word spread first. Let them remember the old tales. Let them wonder if the legends might be true." Price studied his admiral's profile. He had served under her for 15 years, and he had never seen her so focused. And if they respond with hostility, they will not. They will be too shocked, too confused. Blake finally turned from the viewport and looked at her crew. Every man and woman on the bridge understood what this moment meant. Their parents had trained for this. Their grandparents had trained for this. 100 generations had lived and died preparing for the day when humanity would step out of the shadows. "Signal the fleet," Blake ordered. "Maintain formation and continue forward at standard speed. It is time they remembered us." Across the galaxy, the word began to spread. Peller's frantic transmission reached Nexus Prime within hours. The council that had just dismissed humans as ancient. History found itself facing a reality that shattered everything they thought they knew. The ghost species had returned. The vanished ones were vanished no more. And they had brought with them a fleet larger than anything the Galactic Collective had ever assembled. The myths were real. The legends were true. And nothing would ever be the same again. The news spread through the Galactic Collective like wildfire through dry grassland. Within hours, every species in known space had heard the impossible reports. Within days, the story had reached the farthest colonies and the most remote outposts. Humans were real. Humans were alive. And humans had just appeared on the borders of collective space with a fleet larger than anything anyone had ever seen. Emergency sessions convened across a dozen worlds. Leaders who had spent their entire careers dealing with ordinary problems suddenly found themselves facing something extraordinary. Elder Counselor Vethron stood before the assembled representatives in the Grand Chamber of Nexus. Prime and tried to maintain order as chaos erupted around him. "How is this possible?" Ambassador Salira demanded. Her wings fluttered with agitation, and her voice carried across the chamber. "Where have they been for 3,000 years? We believed them extinct," another representative cried out. "Our entire history is built on that assumption. Every textbook, every scientific study, every archaeological report. All of it wrong." Commander Zethner stood apart from the shouting delegates and studied the sensor data on his personal display. His military training allowed him to see past the panic and focus on the facts. The human ships were not just numerous. They were advanced beyond anything the collective possessed. Their power signatures suggested weapons technology that outstripped the best equipment in the collective's arsenal by centuries. He approached Vethran and spoke quietly so that others would not hear. "Counselor, we need to establish contact immediately. If these humans are hostile, we have no chance in a direct confrontation. Our entire combined fleet would be destroyed in a matter of hours." Vethran nodded grimly. "Send a diplomatic vessel. Approach with all peaceful protocols active. We must learn their intentions before we can decide how to respond." The diplomatic cruiser Harmony's voice was dispatched within hours. Ambassador Celira volunteered to lead the delegation despite the danger. She brought with her the finest diplomats the collective could assemble, representatives from 6 different species who had trained their entire lives for moments of first contact. As they approached the human fleet, every sensor aboard the Harmony's voice screamed warnings about the raw power surrounding them. The human ships dwarfed their small cruiser. Any one of those vessels could have destroyed them with a single shot. Admiral Blake received word of the approaching vessel and ordered her fleet to allow it passage. She met the delegation personally in the Resolute's cavernous hangar bay, standing at attention as the alien shuttle touched down on the deck. The Ethoni and Korvathi diplomats stepped off their shuttle and found themselves facing a species they had only known from ancient texts and children's stories. Humans were smaller than the old records had suggested. They looked soft and fragile compared to the scaled Korvathi or the armored Vorkesh. They lacked claws and fangs and natural weapons of any kind. But their eyes held something that the diplomats recognized instantly. It was a look they had seen in predator species across the galaxy. A quiet and calculating intensity that spoke of danger kept carefully under control. "I am Fleet Admiral Catherine Blake of the United Human Coalition," the human woman said. Her voice was calm and steady and carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "On behalf of my people, I welcome you to our fleet." Ambassador Celira found her voice after a moment of stunned silence. "Admiral Blake, the Galactic Collective greets you in peace. We have many questions. So many questions that I hardly know where to begin. I imagine you do." Blake gestured toward a corridor that led deeper into the ship. "Walk with me, Ambassador. I will tell you a story that has been kept secret for 3,000 years. As they walked through the massive vessel, Blake began to explain. 3,000 years ago, humanity had indeed made contact with the galaxy. They had established colonies on dozens of worlds. They had traded with other species. They had begun to integrate into the galactic community. Then they had discovered something terrible. "We call them the Great Enemy," Blake said. Her voice remained steady, but Celira could sense the weight of history behind every word. A machine intelligence that had been spreading from galaxy to galaxy for millions of years. They consumed all organic life in their path. They could not be reasoned with. They could not be negotiated with. They existed only to destroy. Celira felt a chill pass through her despite the warmth of the ship. "We have no records of such an enemy. You would not. Your ancestors were too young when we found them. Too primitive. They had not even developed interstellar travel yet. But we knew that if we stayed visible, if we kept expanding and drawing attention to this region of space, we would lead the machines right to you. They would have wiped out every species in the galaxy." Blake stopped at a viewport that overlooked the assembled human fleet. Hundreds of ships hung in the darkness, their hulls dark and angular and covered with weapons. "So we disappeared. We retreated to the far side of the galaxy, where the machines had not yet reached. We erased every trace of our presence. We destroyed our colonies and our stations and our communications networks. And then we prepared. Prepared for what?" Celira asked. "For war. Blake's expression grew distant as she remembered things she had only read about in history books. Things her grandparents and their grandparents had lived through. For 3,000 years, we built ships and weapons and trained soldiers. Every generation grew up knowing that one day they would have to fight. One day they would have to face the machines. And did you? Did you fight them? We fought them in the darkness where no one could see. A war that lasted millennia. We lost billions of people. Entire worlds burned. Entire generations were born and died knowing nothing but conflict. Blake turned to face Celira directly. But we held the line. And eventually, we pushed them back. And 40 years ago, we destroyed the last of their central processors. Celira struggled to comprehend the scale of what she was hearing. An entire species had fought a secret war for 3,000 years. They had sacrificed everything to protect a galaxy that did not even know they existed. Why reveal yourselves now? She asked. Because the machines are gone. But new threats always emerge. Blake's eyes hardened. We have been watching the Vorkash Dominion. Their expansion patterns. Their disregard for other species. Their cruelty toward the civilizations they conquer. They remind us of what we fought against. The collective struggles against them, Celira admitted. Our fleet is too small. Our technology is inferior. We cannot stop their expansion. We know. That is why we are here. Blake placed a hand on the viewport and looked out at her fleet. Ambassador, humanity has spent 3,000 years in the dark, fighting alone. We are tired of being ghosts. We want to come home. And we want to make sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else. Celira felt tears forming in her eyes. All those centuries of stories and legends. All those tales told to children about the mysterious humans who had vanished from the stars. And the truth was more incredible than any myth. What do you want from us? She asked. Friendship, Blake replied simply. Alliance. The chance to stand beside you instead of hiding in the shadows. She extended her hand in a gesture that was unfamiliar to Celira, but clearly meant as a sign of peace. We protected you for 3,000 years without asking for anything in return. Now we are asking for the chance to be part of the galaxy again. Celira reached out and took the human's hand. It was warm and soft and surprisingly strong. On behalf of the Galactic Collective, she said, welcome home. Word of humanity's return reached the Vorkash Dominion within days. Their spies were everywhere, and their intelligence networks stretched across the galaxy. When the reports arrived at the command fortress of Supreme Warlord Grathker, they caused more confusion than concern. Grathker was a massive creature, standing nearly 3 meters tall with armored skin and 4 powerful arms. He had risen to power through violence and cunning, crushing every rival who dared to challenge him. His empire had grown for 50 years under his leadership, and he had never known defeat. He read the intelligence reports while his war council waited in tense silence around him. The chamber was dark and cold, lit only by the glow of data terminals and the distant stars visible through the viewport. Humans, he rumbled. His voice was deep and harsh, like stones grinding together. The phantom species from nursery tales. The ghosts that mothers use to frighten disobedient children. Their fleet is substantial, Supreme Warlord, his intelligence chief reported. The smaller Vorkash kept his head bowed in submission as he spoke. Our estimates suggest they outnumber the collective's defensive forces by a factor of 3. Perhaps more. Impressive for ghosts. Grathker's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his kind. But consider what this tells us about their nature. They have been hiding for 3,000 years. Whatever they claim about fighting some mysterious machine enemy, they are clearly a species of cowards. They fled rather than face the galaxy. Sir, their weapons technology appears significantly more advanced than our own. The preliminary analysis suggests they could destroy our ships with ease. Technology means nothing without the will to use it. Grathka rose to his full height, towering over every advisor in the room. These humans have spent millennia cowering in the dark. They do not know true war. They do not understand what it means to be a warrior species. They will crumble when faced with Varkesh's strength. He made his decision quickly, as he always did. Hesitation was weakness, and weakness was death. Accelerate our expansion plans. The collective is distracted by these newcomers. Their attention is focused on playing diplomacy with their resurrected myths. We will strike the outer colonies while their guard is down. His war council bowed in acknowledgement and hurried to carry out his orders. None of them dared to question his judgment. Those who questioned Grathkor tended to disappear. Across the border, negotiations between humanity and the Galactic Collective continued aboard a neutral station called Unity Point. Admiral Blake had brought a second delegation, this time including civilian representatives and historians who worked to share the story of humanity's lost years with their galactic neighbors. Dr. Samuel Grant was one of those historians. He was a soft-spoken man in his 70s, with gray hair at his temples and kind eyes behind simple glasses. He had spent his entire career studying the records of the Long War. Every battle, every sacrifice, every generation that had lived and died fighting an enemy that the rest of the galaxy never knew existed. He found himself in conversation with Commander Zethner, who had been assigned to the diplomatic mission as military liaison for the Korvathi delegation. The two of them sat in a quiet observation lounge, watching ships from a dozen species come and go through the station's docking bays. Your people really fought for 3,000 years? Zethner asked. His scaled face was difficult to read, but Grant had learned to recognize curiosity in the Korvathi's tone. Fought, lost, rebuilt, and fought again. Grant activated a small holographic projector and pulled up images from human history that no outsider had ever seen. Burning colonies lit up like torches against the darkness of space. Desperate last stands where soldiers held the line knowing they would never see home again. Ships ramming into enemy formations to buy time for evacuation fleets to escape. The machine intelligences were relentless, Grant continued. They did not negotiate. They did not show mercy. They did not stop. Every generation of humans grew up knowing the war. It shaped everything we are, everything we believe, everything we value. How did you survive? Stubbornness, mostly? Grant smiled faintly at the question. It was something he had thought about for his entire life. Humans have a peculiar trait that seems to be rare in the galaxy. The harder you push us, the harder we push back. Every time the machines thought they had broken us, we found some way to keep fighting. Some new technology, some new strategy, some new reason to hold on. Zethner studied the holographic images for a long moment. He saw cities burning and ships exploding and soldiers dying by the thousands. But he also saw something else. He saw people rebuilding. He saw children being born in the middle of war. He saw hope surviving against impossible odds. Your Admiral Blake speaks of protecting the galaxy, he said finally. Why would you do this? You owe us nothing. Most species would have abandoned others to save themselves. That is the logical choice. That is what the Varkesh would do. Grant considered the question carefully before answering. Because that is not who we want to be. The machines taught us what it means to face extinction. We watched entire worlds die. We saw civilizations wiped out in days. We would not wish that on anyone. Not even species we have never met. Before Zethner could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the station. The peaceful hum of the observation lounge was shattered by blaring sirens and flashing lights. Both men jumped to their feet and rushed toward the command center. They arrived to find chaos. Officers from a dozen species were shouting over each other, trying to make sense of the data flooding in from across the border. Admiral Blake was already there, standing in the center of the room and studying the tactical displays with cold precision. "What is happening?" Zethner demanded. "The Vorkesh," one of the collective officers answered. His voice was shaking. "They are attacking 3 colony worlds simultaneously. Kethren 4, Pelori Prime, the Sanctuary Moons." Elder Counselor Vethron pushed through the crowd, his old face pale with fear. "Our fleet cannot reach those colonies in time. The Vorkesh knew exactly when to strike. Millions of civilians will die before we can respond." Blake said nothing for a moment. She studied the tactical data, calculating distances and response times and weapons capabilities. Then she activated her personal communication device. "Resolute, this is Blake. Signal the fleet. We are moving to intercept." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the human admiral. Vethron stared at her with desperate hope. "Admiral, you would risk your people for hours? We barely know each other. We have only spoken for a few days." Blake met his gaze without hesitation. "We spent 3,000 years fighting to protect species we had never met. Species who did not even know we existed. This is not a risk, Counselor. This is what we came back for." She turned and strode toward the shuttle bay without waiting for a response. Her crew fell in behind her with the discipline of soldiers who had trained their entire lives for exactly this moment. Zethner watched them go and felt something he had not experienced in years. Hope. Real hope that maybe the galaxy would not fall to the Vorkesh after all. Dr. Grant stood beside him and smiled. "You asked why we protect others. Now you will see for yourself." The human fleet arrived at Kethren 4 in a display of technology that stunned every observer across the galaxy. Standard faster-than-light travel required hours to cover such vast distances. Ships had to charge their drives and calculate safe routes and navigate through the complex gravitational fields of interstellar space. The journey from Unity Point to Kethren 4 should have taken the better part of a day. The humans crossed the same space in less than 7 minutes. Their ships simply appeared out of folded space, emerging from nothing like predators stepping out of shadows. One moment the sensors showed empty void. The next moment 500 human warships hung in perfect formation around the planet. The Vorkesh assault force had expected easy prey. Kethren 4 was a mining colony with minimal defenses. The population was mostly workers and their families. There were no military bases, no orbital platforms, nothing that could challenge a proper war fleet. War Master Krethker commanded the assault group from his flagship, the Crusher of Worlds. It was a name he had earned through decades of conquest, and he wore it with pride. His 20 warships had already begun orbital bombardment when sensors detected the incoming fleet. Krethker watched the human vessels materialize on his tactical display. He counted them twice because he could not believe his own eyes. Over 50 capital ships, where moments before there had been nothing but empty space. "What sorcery is this?" one of his officers demanded. His voice cracked with fear that he could not quite hide. "It does not matter." Krethker forced confidence into his voice, even as his mind raced to understand what was happening. He could not show fear before his subordinates. Fear was contagious, and a frightened crew was a defeated crew. They may have appeared quickly, but they are outnumbered. 20 against 50 is not good odds, but we are Vorkesh. We have won against worse. He straightened his massive frame and issued his orders. "Signal all ships to form attack formation. We will show these phantoms that ghosts cannot stand against warriors." The human fleet moved with eerie coordination, taking positions around the Vorkesh formation with mechanical precision. There was no hesitation. No confusion. Every ship knew exactly where to go and what to do. It was like watching a single organism with 500 bodies. At the center of the formation, Admiral Catherine Blake watched from the Resolute's bridge. Her crew operated with the calm efficiency of professionals who had trained for exactly this moment. Every station was manned. Every system was ready. 3,000 years of preparation came down to the next few minutes. "Commander Price," Blake said, without taking her eyes from the tactical display. "Status of civilian evacuation on the surface? Colony Defense Forces have moved the population to emergency shelters, Admiral. Vorkesh ground troops have not landed yet. The bombardment caused significant damage, but most civilians are still alive. Then let us make sure they stay that way." Blake leaned forward in her command chair. "All ships weapons free. Show them what 3,000 years of preparation looks like." The battle was over in 11 minutes. Human weapons technology was not merely advanced. It was devastating beyond anything the Vorkish had ever encountered. Plasma cannons fired through folded space, bypassing shields entirely and striking hulls from impossible angles. Missiles predicted evasive maneuvers before they happened, adjusting course in real time to hunt their targets. Point defense systems created impenetrable webs of destruction that vaporized incoming fire before it could get within 100 kilometers. The Vorkesh fought with courage. They were warriors born and bred for conflict. They had never retreated from any enemy. But courage meant nothing against an opponent that had spent millennia perfecting the art of war. Their ships broke apart under concentrated fire. Hulls cracked and atmospheres vented and reactors detonated in blinding flashes. Escape pods scattered like seeds from a dying flower as crews abandoned vessels that were already dead. War Master Krethker watched his fleet disintegrate around him. Ship after ship vanished from his tactical display. Officers screamed reports that no longer mattered. Damage alarms wailed through corridors that were filling with smoke and flame. His flagship was the last to fall. The Crusher of Worlds had earned its name through 100 conquests, but it could not survive the focused attention of a dozen human warships. As flames consumed his bridge and the deck tilted beneath his feet, Krethker managed one final act. He activated the emergency transmitter and broadcast a message to the Dominion. His voice was calm, despite the destruction around him. A warrior's voice. A warning from the dead to the living. They are not myths. They are not phantoms. They are demons wearing the faces of the weak. Do not challenge them. Do not provoke them. They will destroy everything you send against them. The transmission ended abruptly as the Crusher of Worlds tore itself apart. On the surface of Kethrin 4, the colonists huddled in their shelters and listened to the battle raging in orbit above them. They heard the thunder of weapons fire and the roar of ships breaking apart. They felt the ground shake from debris falling through the atmosphere. Then silence fell. A silence so complete that it seemed unnatural after the chaos of combat. The colonists emerged from their shelters slowly, afraid of what they might find. They looked up at the sky and saw the burning wreckage of Vorkesh ships falling like meteors. They saw the dark shapes of human vessels descending through the clouds. Landing craft touched down near the largest settlement. Ramps lowered and humans emerged, not with weapons raised, but with medical supplies and engineering equipment. They had come to help, not to conquer. Captain Laura Simmons led the ground relief team. She was a woman in her 40s, with steady hands and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. She had served in the last campaigns against the machines, and she knew what it meant to find survivors after a battle. She found herself surrounded by grateful colonists who had never seen a human before. Children stared at her with wide eyes full of wonder. Adults wept openly as they realized they were safe. An elderly Karvathi approached her on shaking legs. His scales were dull with age, and his eyes were wet with tears. He had to look up at her, even though she was shorter than most of his species. "You saved us," he said. His voice trembled with emotion he could not contain. "You were just a story, something we told children to make them feel safe at night. We thought you were myths. We thought you were legends that never existed." Lavra knelt down to his level so she could look him in the eye. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and smiled. "We were always real," she said. "We just had to go away for a while. But we are back now. And we are not going anywhere." News of the Battle of Catherine IV spread faster than any ship could travel. The reports were relayed from station to station, from world to world, from species to species. A Vorkash assault force annihilated in 11 minutes. Not a single human ship damaged. Not a single human life lost. The galaxy began to understand that the myths had been woefully inadequate. The stories had described humans as weak and soft, primitive creatures who had fled from the darkness 3,000 years ago. The stories were wrong. Humanity was not just real. They were terrifying. And they had chosen to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, just as they had always done. Supreme Warlord Grathkor received the news of Catherine IV in his command fortress and sat in stunned silence for a very long time. His entire assault force was gone. 20 warships and their crews, destroyed in the time it took to recite a war chant. The finest warriors of the Dominion, veterans who had conquered 100 worlds, wiped out in 11 minutes. And the humans had not lost a single vessel. For the first time in his long and violent career, Grathkor felt something he had never experienced before. It was cold and heavy in his chest, and it made his thoughts move slowly. It took him several moments to recognize the feeling because he had never known it. Fear. Pure and simple fear. His advisors counseled different responses to the disaster. Some urged immediate counterattack, overwhelming the humans with sheer numbers. The Dominion had thousands of ships. Surely quantity could overcome quality. Others suggested consolidation, pulling back to defensible territory and waiting to see what the humans would do next. A few whispered about negotiation, about finding some way to appease these demons from the darkness. Grathkor listened to all of them and then made his choice. He was a warlord. He had built his empire through strength and aggression. He could not show weakness now, even in the face of this impossible enemy. "Summon the full fleet," he commanded. "Every warship in the Dominion. Every crew. Every soldier. We will show these humans that the Vorkash do not retreat. We do not surrender. We do not bow to anyone." The largest Vorkash fleet in history assembled at their border fortress world within 2 weeks. Over 300 warships, crewed by warriors who had been raised from birth to believe themselves invincible. Grathkor himself took command from his new flagship, eager to avenge the disgrace at Catherine IV. They arrived at the staging point ready for war. Their weapons were charged. Their shields were raised. Their crews chanted songs of battle and conquest. Then they saw what was waiting for them. The human fleet hung in the darkness like a wall of steel stretching from horizon to horizon. Not 50 ships this time. Not 100. Not even 500. Over 1,000 human warships, arranged in perfect formation. Their dark hulls bristling with weapons that could fold space and ignore shields and predict the future. At their center, the Resolute floated like a patient predator waiting for its prey to make the first move. Grathkor stared at the display and felt his blood turn to ice. This was not a fleet. This was an extinction event waiting to happen. Admiral Blake opened a communication channel. Her face appeared on every screen in the Vorkash formation, calm and steady and utterly without fear. "Supreme Warlord Grathkor, I am Fleet Admiral Catherine Blake of the United Human Coalition. You have attacked civilians under our protection. You have tested our resolve. You have seen what we can do. Now you face a choice. Grathker managed to find his voice. What choice? The same choice you gave the species you conquered. The same terms you offered to worlds that stood in your path. Blake's eyes were hard as steel. Surrender completely. Accept collective governance. Disarm your military. Or face us in battle. You asked Dvorkish to submit? Grathker's pride surged despite his fear. We have never submitted to anyone. We are conquerors. We are warriors. We are the dominant species of our sector. Then, you have 10 minutes to reconsider. Blake's voice remained calm, almost conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the fate of an empire. After that, we will demonstrate exactly why 3,000 years of darkness made us what we are. The minutes passed in agonizing silence. Grathker's officers watched him, waiting for the order to attack. His pride screamed for vengeance. His ancestors demanded blood. Every instinct he possessed told him to charge forward and meet his enemies with courage. But he looked at the human fleet. He counted the ships. He remembered the reports from Catherine 4, 11 minutes. 20 ships destroyed in 11 minutes against 50 human vessels. With 300 ships against 1,000, the mathematics were inescapable. The battle would not even be close. His entire fleet would be annihilated before they could fire a single effective shot. Grathker had spent his life believing that courage was the greatest virtue, that a true warrior never backed down from a fight, that death in battle was better than life in shame. But watching his species go extinct was not courage. It was stupidity. Stand down, he ordered. His voice was hollow and empty, and sounded nothing like the warlord he had been. Signal our surrender. The Dvorkish Dominion fell without another shot fired. Within weeks their military was disbanded, their weapons destroyed, their fleets reduced to scrap. The worlds they had conquered were freed. The species they had enslaved were liberated. Their leaders were placed before collective tribunals to answer for their crimes. In the Grand Council chamber of Nexus Prime, humanity formally joined the Galactic Collective. Representatives from every species in known space assembled to witness the moment. The chamber was packed beyond capacity, and millions more watched through remote feeds across the galaxy. Admiral Catherine Blake stood before the assembled representatives, accepting membership on behalf of a civilization that had spent 3 millennia as ghosts. She wore her dress uniform, decorated with medals that represented battles no one else had ever seen. We fought alone for so long, she said. Her voice carried through the chamber and out to every corner of the galaxy. We told ourselves it was necessary, that we were protecting you by remaining hidden. Perhaps we were, but we also lost something. Connection, community. The simple knowledge that we were not the only ones standing against the darkness. She looked out over the assembled representatives. Species that had known humans only as myths and legends and bedtime stories. That changes today. Whatever threats emerge in the future, the galaxy will face them together. No more species fighting alone. No more civilizations disappearing into legend. No more children growing up believing that the universe is too dangerous to hope. Elder Counselor Vethran rose from his seat and crossed the chamber to stand beside her. He was old and tired, but his eyes shone with something that looked like joy. On behalf of the Galactic Collective, we welcome humanity home. May we never forget what you sacrificed for us. May we never take for granted the courage that brought you back from the shadows. And may we always remember that even the darkest night will end when friends stand together. The chamber erupted in applause. The sound was deafening, rolling through the station like thunder and echoing out into the stars beyond. Dr. Samuel Grant watched from the gallery with tears streaming down his weathered face. 3,000 years of isolation finally ended. Generations of sacrifice finally recognized. All those ancestors who had fought and died in the darkness, their courage finally understood. Commander Zethanar stood beside him and spoke quietly beneath the roar of celebration. Your ancestors chose to fight in the darkness, knowing they might never be thanked, knowing that no one would ever know what they had done. They did not do it for thanks, Grant replied. They did it because it was right, because someone had to stand between the innocent and the darkness, because that is what humans do. And now? Grant watched Admiral Blake shake hands with representatives from across the galaxy. He watched species that had never met humans embrace them as friends and allies. He watched a new chapter of galactic history begin. Now we build something better, together. Outside the station, the human fleet maintained its vigil. 1,000 ships crewed by men and women who'd inherited their ancestors' duty and their strength and their stubborn refusal to ever give up. They had been myths. They had been legends. They had been ghosts that haunted the dreams of children. Now they were simply neighbors, friends, protectors standing watch over a galaxy that had finally learned the truth. Humans were not just real. They were exactly the guardians the old stories had promised. And they would never abandon the galaxy again. The stars that had once seemed cold and empty now felt a little warmer, a little safer, a little more like home. Because humanity had returned. And this time, they were here to stay.